Welcome to the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. I'm Pat Wilder, the volunteer coordinator for the center. The not-for-profit center was created by Adlai and Nancy Stevenson and other civic leaders with the mission of enhancing the global understanding and practice of democracy. With these programs, we hope to engage people in democratic dialogue so they can be participants in the solutions. Today we welcome Trita Parsi. 2 years ago, Trita gave us a look at the complicated relationship between Iran and the United States, which he related in his book, Losing an Enemy. This talk will explore the question of U.S. relations with Iran under President Biden. Following Mr. Parsi's presentation, there will be time for a few questions. Please submit them in the chat room. Trita Parsi is an award-winning author and the recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. His previous book, Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, was a silver medal winner of the Arthur Ross Book Award from the Council on Foreign Relations. While his second book, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, was selected by Foreign Affairs Journal as the best book of 2012 on the Middle East. Parsi was born in Iran, but moved for this family at the age of 4 to Sweden in order to escape political repression in Iran. His father was an outspoken academic who was jailed by the Shah and then by the Ayatollah. He moved to the United States as an adult and studied foreign policy and received his PhD at Johns Hopkins School for the Advanced International Studies, where he studied under Professor Francis Fukuyama. Parsi's articles on Middle East affairs have been published in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Financial Times, Jane's Intelligence Review, The Nation, The American Conservative, The Jerusalem Post, The Forward, and others. He's a frequent guest on CNN, PBS's NewsHour, NPR, the BBC, and Al Jazeera. Currently, he's the Executive Vice President of Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank that brings together like-minded progressives and conservatives who promote the ideas that the U.S. foreign policy keep U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. Trita, welcome to the Stevenson Center.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you again, although over Zoom this time. Hopefully, in not too distant of the future, we will be able to do this physically. I'm very grateful for all of you attending today and for the Stevenson Center for inviting me to talk about an issue that unfortunately all too often is in the news, and I think you will see in the next couple of weeks will be more in the news as we are now running into a couple of deadlines that will determine whether the Biden administration will be able to go back into the nuclear deal in a fashion that is acceptable to the United States. We are now facing a situation in which after 4 years of the Trump administration, 3 of which it was officially outside of the deal, the United States unfortunately breached the deal, violated it, and also created a rather unprecedented situation. The United States was actually sanctioning countries for abiding by a UN Security Council resolution. This has never happened before. Usually we would sanction countries if they violate a UN Security Council resolution. But in this case, countries that were abiding by the UN Security Council resolution that embodied the Iran nuclear deal were sanctioned by the United States. And as I'm sure you can understand, created all kinds of challenges and tensions internationally, primarily between the United States and some of its own allies. The Trump administration pursued a strategy that was called maximum pressure. It was premised on the idea that if you just squeeze the Iranian economy sufficiently, the Iranians will throw in the towel, they will cave, they will come creeping to the negotiating table and ask for mercy, which then would allow President Trump to claim that he got a better deal than President Obama did, which seems to be part of the main motivation behind that policy from Trump's perspective himself. 3 years of devastating sanctions. I mean, we're talking about a huge impact on the Iranian economy, particularly the Iranian people, which was further then augmented by COVID, and under which circumstances the United States actually intensified the sanctions to make the impact of COVID even worse on Iran than it was before. Nevertheless, after all of those sanctions and all of that pressure, we did not see the Iranians back an inch or give the Trump administration a single victory. Whether it was on the nuclear front or whether it was on regional matters, the Iranians continued or even intensified the policies that the Trump administration had identified as being problematic and subject for reversal. So on the nuclear issue, for instance, the Iranians used Article 36 of the nuclear deal that allows them to reduce their obligations to the nuclear deal because of the fact that the United States had left the agreement. And that meant that they started to amass more low-enriched uranium, expand their centrifuges, and many of the restrictions that were essential for the value that deal provided the United States and the international community. Fortunately, many of those, or if not all of those measures taken by the Iranians are easily reversible. So they can just ship out the LEU, they can take offline some of the additional centrifuges they have added, etc. It does not seem to create any long-term damage, but for the Iranians to do this, the United States would have to go back into the deal. Biden now comes in knowing quite well that maximum pressure was a failure and just relying on sanctions will not get the United States a better deal. Knows also that the Iranians have now managed, as a result of maximum pressure, to reduce their breakout capability, the time it would take for the Iranians to make a decision to build a bomb to actually having the fissile material for a bomb has now been reduced from 12 months to roughly 3 months. Again, because the US left the deal and the Iranians reduced some of their obligations. So just from the nuclear perspective itself, it's essential for the Biden administration to get back into the deal. But it's not everything. There is a larger geopolitical context that in many ways is equally important, if not even more important than the nuclear issue itself. The Biden administration, much like the Obama administration, but perhaps with a little bit more political dedication and commitment, has recognized, particularly after seeing what's happened in the last 5 years, that the United States really needs to reduce its military footprint in the Middle East. Biden made the promise during the debates that he would remove US troops from the region except counterterrorism contingencies. Other Democratic candidates for president went even further. Elizabeth Warren at one point said that she would bring home all troops. This is reflective of the fact that the American public increasingly has turned to believing that the United States should leave the region militarily, that it doesn't lie in its interest to be there, and that the only way to really end these endless wars is to actually not be there. It's our presence that in many ways has actually got us caught in these endless wars. So that is the new political reality that all of these candidates and President Biden himself is reacting to, but also from a strategic perspective, recognizing that the Middle East is not that important any longer. It is not the same strategic significance that it had 40 years ago. And the United States has bigger challenges elsewhere, partly from China, arguably, but also because we now live in a century in which it's become increasingly obvious that the main threats that faces the United States are actually not from other nation states. It's shared threats from pandemics, from climate chaos, things that you can't bomb away, things that you cannot deter by having the best military, things that actually require a tremendous amount of human collaboration across borders to be able to address. And for that, we have to start rethinking our idea of national security and how we advance it. We have, in the last couple of weeks, roughly had 9/11 amount of American deaths per day as a result of COVID. And $800 billion to the Pentagon has not done anything to be able to reduce that or prevent that. So given all of this, the nuclear deal is seen by the Biden administration as essential for being able to start withdrawing and reducing our footprint in the Middle East. So I'm quite convinced that the Biden administration has the political will to go in that direction. The question is exactly how do you do it? Well, the formula that Biden has preferred and the Iranians themselves have okayed is called compliance for compliance. Both sides will simply just go back into the agreement, with no preconditions. The Iranians will not ask for any compensation for the economic pain that they have suffered as a result of Trump's breach of the agreement. The United States will not ask the Iranians to make further changes to some of the time limitations of the agreement before going into the agreement. Both sides will just walk back in without preconditions. Then once inside the agreement, they can start renegotiating aspects of the deal that they find problematic. From the US perspective, that means that some of the time limitations, some of the restrictions that will be lifted in 3 or 4 or 5 years, they would like to expand those so that they are lifted in 10 years, perhaps. Issues such as proliferation of ballistic missiles is something that the US would like to see included in an add-on agreement to the deal, as well as regional matters. The Iranians have their own issues. The tricky thing that right now seems to be facing the United States and Iran is who goes first. It's kind of silly, mindful of how important it is, but right now they're fighting about who takes the first step. The United States and Tony Blinken, who's the new Secretary of State, have repeated the mantra that the Iranians go back in and then the US does everything that it needs to do to be in compliance with the agreement. The Iranians are making the argument that the United States breached the deal, the United States left the deal, Iran was still in the deal, so it's the United States that needs to take the first step. I personally think that this is kind of, in some ways, even healthy. It means that negotiations essentially have begun. And in the past, there were challenges about who goes first in the JCPOA negotiations, and they found very creative solutions to those. What that required, though, was 2 things: time and political will. Political will does exist. I'm convinced that both the Biden administration and the Iranians under Rouhani and Zarif are committed. Time is a trickier matter. The Iranians are having their elections in June of 2021. That means that from March and onwards, the Iranians are going to be in their political season, as a result, not capable, not able to negotiate. So we roughly have a month and a half maximum. Moreover, the Iranian parliament, under the leadership of Rouhani's political rivals, have passed a law that says that if the United States has not lifted the sanctions it reimposed, sanctions that need to be lifted for the United States to be in compliance with the agreement, if they're not lifted by late February, the Iranians will start enriching uranium at 20%, which would be another significant reduction of Iran's obligations under the deal. So there's a lot of time pressure, which was not necessarily as tight as it was under the JCPOA negotiations. But I remain convinced that that part can still be overcome. The part that is a little bit trickier is the opposition, primarily from the Israeli Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, and from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who do not want to see a nuclear agreement. It's not about whether certain things in the agreement could be tightened. In fact, the top military person in Israel just said 2 days ago that even if the deal is improved, it doesn't matter. It's a strategic mistake to make a deal, which is more similar to the Saudi position. The Saudis never had any real complaints about what was in the deal. They had a complaint that there was a deal, because a deal meant that the United States would start to resolve its tensions with Iran. It would pave the way for the United States to start reducing its military presence in the region, because most of that military presence is to balance Iran, as the United States essentially was part of a coalition against Iran. Whereas if the nuclear issue is resolved and other issues can be resolved, why should the US-Iran conflict continue to exist? The US wants to resolve it. And Obama told the Saudi king, point blank, we're trying to resolve our tensions with Iran. We suggest that Saudi Arabia does the same. This deeply offended the Saudi king. And as I mentioned earlier on, the Biden administration knows that the deal is important in order for a withdrawal to take place, or at least a reduction of America's military footprint. And that's exactly what, from the Saudi, Israeli, and the UAE perspective, they are opposed to and do not want to see. So this is coming at the Biden administration very fast. I mean, they've been in office for not much more than a week right now. They have so many other crises to deal with, particularly internally. And unfortunately, the schedule of this issue is such that they were going to have to deal with it very quickly. And the Israelis in particular have already thrown the first punch against Joe Biden. So what in the past was a slow escalation of tensions between Obama and Netanyahu over the Iran deal has now started right away at the maximum level from the very beginning. And that is very, very worrisome. I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions and look forward to a very good conversation. Thank you.
Let's start with some of the questions from our audience. Can you further describe some of the hardships that are being suffered by the Iranian people?
Certainly. The sanctions that the United States under Trump imposed on Iran were essentially covering everything. It was even banks. I mean, first of all, the sanctions, we have to understand, sometimes governments present them as being targeted, and some of them are targeted. But the targeted sanctions end up becoming irrelevant if you at the same time have such sanctions that attack the entire financial system and cuts off Iran's banking system entirely from the rest of the world. That means that financial transactions are sanctioned. So for instance, on paper, medical equipment were not sanctioned. However, the financial transaction that would take place for the Iranians to buy medical equipment was sanctioned. And even if you ended up managing to get an OFAC license to do it, you still had a situation in which most banks, because they're not charities, they're making money, were deeming it being too risky for them to engage in such financial transactions, even if they're permitted. And that was incidentally also deliberate, because the US government designed the sanctions in such a way to be somewhat unclear, and then having astronomical fines, $9-12 billion fines if you violated them. And the predictable result was that all of the legal counsel at every bank was, you know what, this is too risky, just don't touch anything that has the word Iran in it. Which incidentally, just to give you an indication of how that translated in practice, it meant that today here in the United States, and I don't encourage any of you of doing it because it's risky, but if you were to send $50 to a friend of yours on Venmo or PayPal, and in the comment section, just write the word Iran, there's a very significant likelihood that your PayPal account will be frozen and closed. Because that's this mechanisms that these financial companies have put into place, that if there's anything that has the word Iran, Persia, etc. in it, it immediately flags it and blocks your account, because they want to be careful not to engage in anything that could violate US sanctions, because they could end up with billion-dollar fines. So under those circumstances, medicine was not going to Iran, and it wasn't going to Iran under the pandemic. And in the beginning of the pandemic, as we all remember, it wasn't complicated medicine that was required. It was PPE. It was all of these different things to just be able to protect first line defenders, medical personnel, etc. But all of that was in a massive shortage in Iran. It was a massive shortage in many countries, but in Iran, they couldn't even buy it. Medicine, simple medicine could not be bought. So we've seen unemployment go up, inflation go up, and the standard of living dropping dramatically in the country. And part of the reason why this is so worrisome is because this is blindly affecting a population that frankly has very limited ability to have an impact on the policies of their governments. They're not at fault here, but they're the ones who are suffering from these sanctions. Secondly, we also know by practice and experience that massive amount of sanctions can cause a country's economy to collapse. It can cause mayhem internally, but it very rarely, if ever, leads to the collapse of the government. Take a look at Venezuela, for instance. Venezuela is in an even worse situation than Iran when it comes to its economy and the sanctions they're faced with. But the Maduro government is still there, and it's not likely to fall anytime soon. So you can actually even destroy the entire country and still not manage to get the political policy change that you're looking for. But in the process, you will be making that country ungovernable and make that country essentially a failed state. That's what happened with Iraq sanctions. Even the State Department's own report, internal report as to why it was so difficult to govern Iraq after the occupation, had a chapter on how sanctions for a decade, UN sanctions and US sanctions, had essentially destroyed the fabric of the Iraqi society and made it ungovernable. And that's the risk Iran runs to become which will be extremely destabilizing for the region as a whole if these sanctions remain in place. And mindful of the fact that these sanctions are not achieving their policy objective, meaning changing Iran's regional policies or nuclear policies, it's quite understandable that that is not the path that the Biden administration wants to go down on, because their objective is not the destruction of Iran. Their objective is to make sure that their measures are put in place that Iran does not become a nuclear power.
Trita, this is Warwick Stevenson. I'm going to jump in and continue with some questions, but to follow on with that very interesting insight into the effect of sanctions, since these sanctions have been placed, how do the clergy or the military benefit?
Unfortunately.
What we have in Iran is the same phenomena that we've seen in other countries that have been under severe sanctions, which is the governments and key institutions within government manage to find ways to not only work around the sanctions, but benefit from the sanctions. And then you end up having a sanctions economy. The IRGC, the military, is in control of Iran's borders. And as a result, they control the smuggling. So lucrative smuggling emerges when a country is under sanctions, and the benefits and the rewards of that ends up into the pockets of the IRGC, or at least elements of the IRGC, which is part of the reason why actually there are strong elements inside of Iran on the conservative side that prefer the Iranian economy to be under sanction. On the one hand, it enriches them, and on the other hand, it halts and prevents political evolution inside the country that would undermine their power base and their standing inside their power within the political system of Iran. That's why many of those who want to see Iran move in a more open and democratic direction see as a first necessary step that the Iranian economy is opened up, because as long as it's closed, it's very difficult for the Iranian public to really put pressure on the government, because so much of the power of the country is concentrated in the hands of the military and the clergy and those elements that actually are benefiting from the sanctions.
And again, to continue with the related, we have Maria who asks, are there countries that are helping Iran or evade sanctions?
So with the Trump administration sanctions, the Trump administration was so aggressive in implementing it. So there had been countries in the past that had helped Iran evade sanctions, done it for their own profit, of course, and much of that was actually clamped down on. However, it still had an ability to circumvent sanctions through a couple of channels. One was China. The Chinese have plenty of companies that have no exposure to the American market, and as a result, the US had very little ability to really punish them. Secondly, because of the long border between Iran and Iraq, and because of Iran's influence in Iraq, there was a lot of smuggling that was taking place from there as well, that gave the Iranians a degree of oxygen for their economy. And what usually happens under these circumstances is that it's extremely difficult to keep that sanctions wall tight for a long period of time. Over time, always there's going to be cracks here and there. There's going to be lucrative opportunities for smuggling that emerges that people will not be able to resist. So that's why if there's a sanctions policy that is going to be effective, it has to be effective rather quickly, because the actual sanctions pain tends to wither away slowly by surely over time. And in the case of the Trump administration, after 3 years, it was quite clear they simply, there was no point of pressure that they could reach that could cause the Iranian state to make the calculation that shifting its national security policy was in its best interest to do in order to guarantee its own survival. And that's, again, part of the reason why sanctions almost never work on these cases. You're targeting policies that are so central to the other state that there's almost no pain point that you can reach that would cause the state to rethink those policies.
It's just so interesting. So if I understand, would you say then that the sanctions have almost no possible chance of bringing regime change, if that's the US goal, and may actually reinforce hardliners and the clergy within the country?
Well, reinforcing the clergy and the hardline has already happened, and we've seen that in the past as well. When it comes to regime change, I think, we just don't have examples in the literature in which that has worked. Everyone points to South Africa as one example, and it's the only example that exists. But even the circumstances there were very, very different. You had a majority population that was in favor of the sanctions, that were asking for it. You had an economy in South Africa that even on its own grounds were starting to have major problems because the advanced part of the economy saw apartheid as a major problem. They needed skilled labor, and apartheid was partly internally not allowing that to happen, but also because of the international isolation, South Africa had, understandably and correctly, justifiably, great difficulties being able to attract that kind of skilled labor. You had an agricultural segment of the economy that needed unskilled labor, and as a result had an interest in sustaining apartheid. So there was a major tension between those that was occurring that probably explained what happened with the fall of apartheid more so than the sanctions alone. And in the case of Iran, in the JCPOA, sanctions did play a role. I mean, sanctions, if done the right way, can provide a degree of leverage. What I think we've seen in Washington is that there's such an over-reliance on sanctions. And also many of the sanctions have been designed not to be lifted. So they're not been designed to be a leverage in a negotiation. They've been designed to be there permanently in order to provide a cheap containment policy. The intention of some of those who put these sanctions in place was to make sure that this would be there essentially forever in order to shift the balance of power in the region away from Iran. So they were not designed to be lifted. And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult for the US later on to try to lift it, because it had been deliberately constructed to make it difficult to lift. So you have all of those challenges. That doesn't mean that sanctions cannot play a role, but you have to be very careful of how you design it. And if you put it at the very center of your policy, almost always they tend to fail.
Fascinating. And so moving beyond sanctions now, here's a question from Joseph. It said, you noted that the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign was a unilateral effort. How should the United States seek to engage its partners, particularly countries in the Middle East, in formulating a new, more effective policy towards Iran?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And I would actually start off from a different starting point. It's not a policy towards Iran. I think the United States needs a policy towards the region that is cohesive. We have not had that. We have looked at the region and essentially had one policy towards one country that completely contradicted how we dealt with some other countries. And in some ways, the JCPOA actually increased that contradiction, because suddenly, in my view, we were going in a constructive direction with Iran, but we didn't allow that to help reshape our policy towards Saudi Arabia, for instance. Instead, we, even under the Obama administration in this last year, there was a feeling that now we needed to compensate the Saudis for having struck the nuclear deal. I thought that was really fundamentally the wrong way of going about it. First of all, if the United States does something that squarely lies in its interests, it doesn't have to compensate anyone for it, particularly countries that benefit from it, because Iran not being able to build a nuclear weapon is actually to the benefit of the region and the globe as a whole. But more importantly, we had an opportunity there to be able to redefine some of the other relationships in the region and have the United States elevate itself above the regional rivalries that exist and try to find a way to help resolve them, rather than the posture that we've had in the last 4 years and that we traditionally have had, which is that we make the rivalries of our allies our own rivalries, and we become entangled in their conflicts. Many of them have no bearing on US national interest and security, and it essentially turns us into belligerents in these conflicts instead of being part of the solution. So what we need to do in the case of Iran, in my view, or the Middle East as a whole, first of all, I think we need to go back into the deal, because we need to make sure that there is no risk of an Iranian path towards a nuclear weapon. That is step one. We need to make sure that that situation is first contained. Secondly, I think we need to have a very frank conversation with some of our partners in the Persian Gulf, and we have to recognize something that I know, at least implicitly, people in the Biden administration have recognized, which is our own military posture and presence in the region, unfortunately, has oftentimes helped destabilize the region and fuel reckless behavior by our own partners. Take Saudi Arabia, for instance. In the last 4 years, Saudi Arabia has not only waged a horrific war in Yemen that has created the worst humanitarian crisis in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia kidnapped the prime minister of Lebanon because they didn't like some decisions he had made. We oftentimes forget that. And the prime minister was only released after the personal intervention of Emmanuel Macron of France. Saudi Arabia imposed that blockade on Qatar that now has been lifted, although the underlying problems remain. And of course, beheaded a Washington Post columnist. Would Saudi Arabia have made a single one of these decisions if it felt that they actually would carry a cost in Washington, D.C.? I think for a very long time, and this is not limited to the Trump administration, many of the partners in the region have felt that they have a complete carte blanche to do whatever they want, and the US's role is to simply just stand by them and protect them when they're doing it. And that has actually fueled reckless behavior rather than containing it. Yemen, for instance, would not have occurred had the Saudis calculated that the US would not end up supporting it, which it did under Obama. And almost every Obama official that was involved in that decision publicly is now saying that that was a big mistake. So I think by signaling that we actually are going to reduce our military footprint in the region, we will incentivize our partners to take diplomacy much, much more seriously, because they've had plenty of opportunities to engage in diplomacy, but they have not been incentivized to do so, because frankly and quite rationally, if you're sitting in Riyadh, why would you engage in that type of painful diplomacy in which you would have to engage and commit to some painful compromises with Iran in order for Iran to give compromises, if you simply can just continue to live under the protection of America's security umbrella? As long as that second option exists, that you can just continue as is, you're not going to be incentivized to take diplomacy seriously and engage in it honestly and with the intent of making it successful. So I think we do have to signal clearly. We want to help bring about a diplomatic solution. We want to promote a regional dialogue. We do not want to be a party to the conflicts. We want to be party to the solution and help bring about that. We're not going to necessarily lead it because the region itself needs to take a stronger leadership role, but none of that really, our partners ourselves will not be incentivized to go in that direction if they think that it's just easier for them to sabotage that diplomacy, because if they sabotage it, the US will revert back to the current position, which is to just protect them and ask no questions. So it's the fundamentals of our approach to the region that I think needs to be reassessed. But in that diplomacy, rest assured, just as much as the Iranians had to give significant concessions on the nuclear front, I'm pretty confident that they would have to do that on the regional front as well. And that's where I think there is a win-win, because all sides need to compromise on this. But our own presence and our posture of essentially having that balance of power situation in the region has been an obstacle, and we need to start undoing that in order to create the ripeness for a diplomatic solution in the region to emerge.
So Trita, let's stay with this this topic of the neighboring countries and the and our partners, if you will. How do you see the credibility of the United States right now in the Middle East? How does Israel, how does Saudi Arabia, Jordan, how are they looking at the United States right now?
I think under the Trump years, the credibility of the United States on almost all fronts, in all ways, took a huge hit. I mean, let's not forget the tremendous credibility loss of the United States leading a diplomatic effort for several years, driving it towards success, and then gleefully walk out of it a year later and punish countries that choose to stay within it. That's a major credibility loss. And that credibility loss we will see in the forthcoming negotiations, because now, not just the Iranians, the Europeans want to have guarantees that the next American president, particularly if the next American president is called Mike Pompeo or Tom Cotton, will not undo what is going to be agreed upon, if anything is agreed upon, in the next couple of months or years. And that is not a problem the United States needed to give guarantees to before. but now it will, and it will increase the cost and weaken the US's negotiation position. From the perspective of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis, there's a different kind of credibility loss. When, as a result of maximum pressure, we saw these attacks in the Persian Gulf against oil tankers, most likely done by the Iranians. We saw attacks, drone attacks against oil fields in Saudi Arabia, again, most likely by the Iranians. The Saudis concluded that Iran was behind it and expected that the United States, under Trump, would implement the Carter Doctrine, which means that the United States would come to the defense of Saudi Arabia. Trump did not want to do that. He did not want to go to war with Iran on behalf of Saudi Arabia. I actually agree with Trump on that point. I do not see it as being in the interest of the United States to go into war with Iran. And if the Iranians were behind it, which I am convinced they were, that only happened because the US was imposing maximum pressure and preventing Iran from selling its own oil. When the Iranians were selling their oil, they were not doing any of these things. This happened only because we prevented them from selling oil, and they were trying to impose a cost on us and our allies for having that maximum pressure policy in the first place. But from the perspective of the Saudis, it meant that now the United States had abandoned the Carter Doctrine and the US had lost credibility because it was obligated to defend Saudi Arabia. So even those who were very close to Trump and who were very happy that he left the JCPOA, nevertheless felt that even they had issues with US credibility. Now, one very interesting thing that happened after that. A lot of people in Washington, the conventional wisdom is, well, if the US is not implementing and upholding the Carter Doctrine, is not the security guarantor of the Persian Gulf, the region will descend into chaos. Well, first of all, even with the Carter Doctrine, the region has clearly been moving towards chaos. Pax Americana doesn't have the best track record. In 1998, the region had 5 armed conflicts. By 2019, under America's military protection, the region suffered from 22 military conflicts. So even with it, it's not as if it's been particularly great. But what really happened in the months and weeks after the attack and the US's failure from the Saudi perspective to protect them is really fascinating. Guess what happened? The Saudis and the Emiratis started to have their secret negotiations with the Iranians. Again, going back to what I said before, once they realized that the option of protection didn't exist, they started to rediscover the value of diplomacy. And that diplomacy continued up until the US once again moved into the region militarily and assassinated Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd or so of 2020. What oftentimes is not referred in the media, although it's completely public, is that Soleimani was in Iraq as part of the dialogue with the Saudis, because it was the Iraqi government that was the go-between between the Saudis and the Iranians. The Saudis had sent the Iranians a message. Soleimani was there because he was going to meet 8 a.m. in the morning the next day with the Iraqi prime minister to hand over Iran's response to whatever it was the Saudis had communicated. And that's when the United States assassinated him, or the night before. And we saw once again the Saudis and the UAE diplomacy with Iran kind of fall away because, again, the option of being under some form of American protection appeared to have reemerged.
Oh my goodness, Trita, so many topics to bring in there, but you just mentioned, well, General Soleimani and sort of the hidden punch. Well, can you describe how Israel may be involved in these, and Saudi in this kind of hidden democracy, and how it affects the JCPOA or future relations with Iran? U.S. relations with Iran?
So I don't know. I think the Iranians have made some accusations that the Israelis were involved. I don't know if that's the case. I think the United States probably has sufficient intelligence and ability to do this on their own without Israeli help. Of course, I think strongly that the Israelis were behind the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, which was one of the Iranian nuclear scientists. The Israeli officials have even admitted that, both to Politico and to New York Times. So I don't think it's much under question any longer. But I don't think I've not seen any evidence that would convince me that there was Israeli involvement in the assassination of Soleimani. I fear that that is not the end of that story, unfortunately. The Iranians keep on signaling that, their response by targeting American air bases in Iraq was just the first step, is not the end of their revenge, as they call it. And I think there's also a narrative out there that I have some question marks about that says that the Iranians deliberately targeted the bases in such a way to minimize American casualties in order to make sure that they could say that they had responded, but there would be no further escalation. And that's kind of what ended up happening. But people I've spoken to on the ground say that that was actually, there was no indication that that was by design. On the contrary, US military personnel on the ground feel like they just got absolutely lucky that no Americans got killed. And if Americans had gotten killed, there's a very significant likelihood that that would have led to a war. I saw a question from an old friend of mine, Lance Lindblom, about the first punch that Netanyahu had given Biden. I mentioned that earlier on. I didn't specify what it was. And it actually is the assassination of Fakhrizadeh. We have seen in the past that the assassination of these nuclear scientists have had no real long-term or even medium-term impact on the trajectory of Iran's nuclear program. And also the timing of them and who they have chosen to assassinate oftentimes were such that it really could not have had any major impact on the nuclear program. The timing oftentimes was in order to, at moments where there was an opportunity for diplomacy, or they had reached a critical point in which an agreement could be found. And the timing of the Israelis choosing those specific times to do the assassination seemed to have suggested that it was actually aimed at sabotaging the diplomatic opportunity. In fact, the last time it happened in 2011, the Obama administration was so ticked off by it that Hillary Clinton took to the podium and personally on camera condemned it and said that the US has absolutely nothing to do with it. And the reading clearly was that this was done by the Israelis to sabotage very nascent diplomatic outreach that had been done, but actually were quite promising. In fact, they are what led to the nuclear deal later on. And doing this assassination weeks after Biden had become president, to me suggests that this actually was a first punch against Biden, because the real target was Biden's diplomacy. They were hoping to create a crisis that would make it even more difficult than it already is for Biden to go down that path. Because it was no mystery that that Biden wanted to go back into the deal. And most prime ministers and presidents in the world would have used the time between the election and inauguration to put themselves in the best possible relationship with the new American president. If they had one from before, they would renew it. If they needed one, they would create it. The only exception is Bibi Netanyahu, that from the very outset has very aggressively gone against Biden. The assassination, I think, was the first punch. We saw another punch just 2 days ago when the top Israeli official said, military official said that that if the United States goes into the deal again, Israel may start a war. In fact, the cabinet minister of Netanyahu said this 2 weeks ago, that if the US goes back into the nuclear deal, Israel will start a war. That is clearly a very aggressive measure against Biden and his options to go back into the nuclear deal. And what is mystifying to me is how the calculation on the Israeli side is that this actually will be to the benefit of Israel itself. I find it very, very likely that this will end up being quite detrimental to Israel, because I don't see it as likely of succeeding. I think it will fail. But in the process, Netanyahu will, from the very beginning, have ruined his relationship, not just with the president of the United States, Joe Biden, but also largely with the Democratic Party, who right now just so happens to control both chambers of Congress.
Trita, to follow on, we have a question from Elliot, who, if I may, I will paraphrase, but you've spoken about those aggressive actions being taken to undermine diplomacy. How then should the U.S. respond? What sort of signals should we see the Biden administration undertaking to reach out to Iran, to begin the re-engagement with the JCPOA? What should we look for and encourage the Biden administration to undertake?
Well, I think there's diplomatic meetings within the Commission for the JCPOA. The U.S. can just show up and restart those conversations. Right now, to the best of my knowledge, there is no direct contact between the two sides. No one has been tasked to do it. There's article says that Rob Malley, who is, one of the best diplomats the U.S. has, would become the Iran envoy. If that's the case, that would be a very clear signal that the Biden administration really is not only serious about getting back into the JCPOA, but also very serious about having add-on agreements that addresses Iranian actions in Syria, Hezbollah, and other things as part of add-on negotiations that deal with regional issues that were never part of the JCPOA, were never designed to be part of the JCPOA, but were viewed as things that should be addressed diplomatically once the JCPOA is in place. And that was the plan. It would have gone forward had it not been for Trump getting elected and walking out. We lost 4 years of an opportunity to address Yemen, Syria, all of these different issues that are significant problems, but we couldn't do it while we ourselves were in breach of a nuclear agreement that everyone else, or at least the UN Security Council 15-0 viewed as essential. So I think the step first is to go back into the deal, and then as quickly as possible, start have these other negotiations. And on those regional matters, those regional countries need to be included. There's no value of having a conversation about Persian Gulf security if the Saudis are not at the table. They have to be included. And I know some of them are upset that they're not included in the nuclear talks, but that's a different story, because the nuclear deal issue is not just a regional issue, it's a global issue. But when it comes to Persian Gulf, then obviously they have to be included in that. And I don't see any reason as to why the United States wouldn't include them. I don't think there's an appetite to including them in the JCPOA, because so far they've shown themselves not being inclined to want to have a JCPOA regardless of the details. So you don't necessarily include those that have shown intent to sabotage it. But when it comes to the regional issues, there's no way of doing it unless they are included.
And Trita, I know that your time is limited. We are planning on about 10 or 12 more minutes. We at the Stevenson Center and the people watching and our organization very much thank you for your support, and thank you for your, the opportunity to speak to you. I hope that we have a time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and to continue in that, looking at domestic issues or the domestic divide in the United States. We have a question from Elliot, and I'll just read. Is there not a problem that we have partisan differences at home on what the policy should be? Does that not create a situation where policy can shift greatly with change of administration? Should we not worry? Should we not try to find key points where we can agree on a unified approach at water's edge as was done in the past, or is that no longer realistic?
Ideally, of course, it absolutely should be. And we see the cost of not having it, because it creates a situation in which an agreement is signed and then unsigned and then signed again, perhaps. And I mean, it is not the conduct of a superpower or even any responsible state. So it is a major problem. But it's also a major problem for us not to be able to sign agreements until we have sorted out our internal differences, because it will likely lead to us not having any such agreements at all. And some of these things are going on time schedules that are not following America's internal political, the schedule of America's internal divisions. So we're forced to deal with these issues because they're there and they don't care about our internal divisions. But us not having fixed those issues obviously weakens our negotiating position, weakens the durability of the agreement. So it is a major problem without a doubt. There's no doubt about it. And it's really fascinating. During the negotiations of the JCPOA, the main concern was the divisions inside of Iran. Will hardliners in Iran respect the agreement? I mean, that was really on top of the minds of all of the US and European negotiators. And I suspect none of the Iranians were necessarily worried about American divisions beyond, Tom Cotton's annoying letter to the Iranian leaders saying that you can't negotiate with Obama because we'll undo what he signs. But beyond that, I don't think any one of them either expected or anticipated what we have now seen in the last 4 years. So again, absolutely, it's necessary. We need to do it, but we are not we don't have the luxury of putting a pause on all kinds of international crises until we sort out our own internal issues.
And to now maybe switch over to the Iranian domestic, one of our questioners, Mark, asks, first, thanks you for your presentation, but asks also about the Iranian elections in June. Can you offer some insight in how those may play out concerning the JCPOA or our relations in general?
We should be very worried about that because we, just as much as in 2016, the United States had a conservative presidential candidate, or all presidential candidates on the Republican Party who ran on an anti-JCPOA platform. That is very likely going to be the case in the Iranian elections as well, in which the hardliners will be trying to outcompete each other on who is mostly anti-JCPOA, who is more anti-engagement with the United States. And that's, again, what I said earlier on, creates this time crunch in which it's important for the United States to make sure that the JCPOA is revived before Iran ends up getting potentially getting a hardline president that is against it, and then could complicate matters further. What has happened in Iran over the last couple of years is very, very unfortunate, because it's not just the JCPOA that has come under question. And I think large parts of the population now view the JCPOA as having not been beneficial to Iran, whereas it had 80+% support when it first was signed. But it's not just the JCPOA, it's the very idea of engagement with the West, diplomacy with the West, that has come under question, precisely because of a perception that the West simply is not trustworthy and it doesn't respect its own signature. So why engage in these costly compromises if the US and the West doesn't uphold its promises? That's a real problem, because it means that people who otherwise have not been at all sympathetic to the very anti-Western perspective and narratives of the hardliners have now started to think that the hardliners may have been right all along. And that would be a major shift in the country, because in the last 40 years, or at least in the last 25 years, you had a government that was an obstacle to engagement with the United States, whereas you had a society that deeply yearned for that engagement. And now we may end up in a society that, because of this very, very bitter experience, may not be a majority against engagement, but it will not at all be as strongly in favor of engagement as it was before.
And this is a little bit of a dark question, but what is your worst case scenario for an acceleration of events concerning the US and Iran, or concerning the entire Middle East?
I would say that the worst case scenario is that either the attempts to go back into the deal fail, or they're sabotaged by outside actors. We end up with a very unfortunate Iranian election in which hardliners take over, and they want to show themselves as tough. They think that the best way of dealing with the United States is actually to aggressively expand the nuclear program, just like Trump did. He wanted to aggressively expand sanctions in order to get a better deal. The Iranian hardliners may have a mirror image of that calculation. Let's expand the nuclear program much more aggressively. In fact, let's do what the North Koreans did. They went to the negotiating table once they had a nuclear weapon, not once they had enrichment, and negotiate at that point. And then the United States will be forced to deal with Iran in the same manner that it deals with North Korea, or at least it did under Trump. So that would be, and that in and of itself, I think, would significantly increase the risk of military confrontation. And it's unfortunately very, very, I wouldn't say it's very likely, but it's not a scenario that we can dismiss. It is quite plausible, because there's still a lot of challenges in the negotiations, and then even more so challenges when it comes to external actors and political circumstances.
We have a question from Lorraine about, well, I'll read it, but what is China doing during this period? Are they helping Iran skirt any sanctions? Are they particularly interested or involved?
The Chinese actually were very constructive in the negotiations. They actually played a key role in some of the implementation of it when it came to dismantling one of Iran's nuclear reactors, for instance. So during the negotiations back then, they were very constructive, as were the Russians, by the way. Whether that will be the case going forward remains to be seen, because now we're also at the risk of seeing US-China relations go in a very, very negative direction. I don't think Biden is going to do what the Trump administration did, in which they actually wanted to have a great power competition and Cold War with China. But if we get close to that, then it will further complicate the JCPOA negotiations, because the JCPOA may end up becoming an arena for the Chinese and the United States to clash rather than collaborate. And again, that's another one of those factors that makes it all the more important to get this done fast before other types of conflicts that may not have anything to do with Iran or its nuclear program itself ends up becoming a factor that complicates or even sabotages it. Can I try to end on something positive? I don't want to depress people too much. I want to make sure you guys want to invite me back at some point. Let me also put forward a potential positive scenario. If there is a return, and if the sanctions relief ends up working better, which also can happen by the US doing other things that can quickly get the Iranian economy to move in the right direction, then there is also a decent likelihood that that will affect the vote of the Iranian public, and the rather likely conservative outcome that we see right now may actually not become as likely and become more contested. And as a result, instead of facing that very dark scenario, we actually may end up getting some serious and much needed regional diplomacy, be able to build on what could have been built on 4 years ago if Trump had not chosen to walk out of the deal, and then start addressing all of these different issues, from Syria to Yemen to Hezbollah to proxies in Iraq to ballistic missiles. And I think that would be the right direction to go in. And I think we have now reached a point in which all other solutions to the region have failed. So now we are forced to actually more seriously look at diplomacy. One challenge there, and I want to make sure I mention this in order not to be accused of just painting a rosy picture. One challenge here for the United States is, if it wants to see the Iranians not proliferate missile and give up other things in the region, which I think is perfectly legitimate to ask for, then we're also going to have to make changes in US policy. We're not going to be able to sell gazillions of dollars of weapons to Saudi Arabia, who already spends 5 times as much money on defense and military equipment than Iran does. If we want the Iranians to take good steps and back down from certain things, we will also have to stop pouring weapons into that region, because that is fueling Iran's sense of insecurity and pushes us in the direction of doing the very things that we don't like to see. So it will require a compromise on all ends, not just from the Saudi, from the Israeli, from the Iranian side, but also from the American side. But some of those compromises and measures, I think ultimately are going to be good for the US itself, because we should not be in a situation in which arms sales to the region is the driving factor of our policy. And I fear that too often that has ended up being the case.
Trita, thank you so much for bringing it back to a note of hope, a note of positivity. May I ask one last, for our engaged public, what can the public do to support this vision that you just presented?
I think, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you all need to be in touch with your members of Congress and voice your opinions on these issues. If you agree with the things I've said, you should be calling your members of Congress and saying, please do everything you can to create the political space necessary to have a re-entry to the JCPOA. And once we re-enter the JCPOA, please provide your support for the United States becoming a driver and a leader of diplomacy, rather than us by default getting entangled in all of these rivalries that exist in the region, in which we should be on the side of a solution rather than being on the side of whoever happens to be our friend or ally. I mean, it's oftentimes ended up causing very bizarre situations. So for instance, just as a quick example, prior to the Yemen war, the United States viewed the Houthis as the main force against Al-Qaeda, again, in Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. Then the Saudis went into that war, and we ended up default supporting the Saudis, and then we were undermining, and the Saudis and the UAE actually at times were collaborating with Al-Qaeda against the Houthis. I'm not saying the Houthis are good or bad. I'm just saying, we end up being on the side of everyone in some of these conflicts precisely because we don't know what we're doing. So we should stop doing that, and getting pressure on Congress to be to support that, I think would be very good.
Trita, once again, I thank you for the extended time, and thank you for your insight, your work in this very important area. I know you have another conference that you're going to right now. So thank you again from the Stevenson Center.
Thank you so much.
In public.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And for the Stevenson Center attendees, Pat Wilder will be joining us here very soon, and she's going to give us an update on future events. And future events, there she is. Oh, Pat, you're still on.
Now let's try it again. Every time I click it, it turns off on me.
Pat, first of all, let me apologize. I think a technical glitch prevented you from joining in that question. But thank you for your help, and you're going to do a wrap here. So I'm going to.
I certainly am. Well, like I said, I want to echo your thanks to Trita for returning to the center and sharing this presentation with us. We really appreciate his sharing his thoughts and experiences and giving us some reason for hope for a more peaceful relationship with Iran. I want to encourage everyone to visit Trita's website and learn more about his contributions and accomplishments. And please add the Quincy Institute to your list of searches. In this time of global turmoil, it's important for us to become familiar with people and organizations who are dedicated to encouraging solutions. Again, thank you for attending this program. Please come back to the center's next program, which is going to be on Sunday, February 28th at 2 o'clock. We're going to look at the risks of oil trains to public safety. If you'd like to learn about upcoming events at the Stevenson Center, or view this program or share it with your friends, please visit the Stevenson Center on Democracy website. Again, thanks so much for visiting with us today, and please come back. We'd love to see you again. Bye-bye.